The entire check-in area went dead silent. Every single person in that crowded terminal was staring at me, standing there with my boarding pass in hand, and at her, this entitled woman who just spent the last 5 minutes loudly mocking my accent in front of everyone. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been quietly listening to the airline staff chatting behind the counter in perfect Spanish for the past 10 minutes. And now, as the head supervisor walked over with that look in her eyes, I realized this Karen was about to get the surprise of her life. "Ma'am," the supervisor said, looking directly at me with a warm smile, "Puedo ayudarla en español? I heard what just happened here, and I want to make sure you're taken care of." The look on Karen's face was absolutely priceless. But that was just the beginning of what turned into the most satisfying airport experience of my entire life. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and at 62 years old, I thought I'd seen every type of person this world had to offer. I've been traveling for work and family for over 40 years, back when you could actually show up at the airport 30 minutes before your flight and still make it on time. This particular Tuesday morning, I was flying from Phoenix to Miami to see my newest granddaughter for the first time. My daughter Carmen had just given birth 2 weeks earlier, and I'd been counting down the days. At my age, every new grandchild feels like a precious gift, and I wasn't about to let anything ruin this trip. I'd packed light just to carry on with some baby clothes I'd been knitting for months, plus a few traditional Mexican recipes I wanted to teach Carmen. The kind of recipes my own grandmother taught me when I was barely tall enough to reach the stove. Now, I'll be honest with you. English is my second language. I came to this country when I was 25, worked my tail off for decades as a bilingual teacher, and raised 3 beautiful children who are all successful professionals today. But after all these years, I still have what people call an accent. Most folks don't mind it, some even say it's charming. But every now and then, you run into someone who thinks having an accent makes you less American or less intelligent. I should have sensed trouble the moment I walked up to the check-in counter. The woman in front of me, let's call her Karen because, honestly, what else would you call her, was having some kind of issue with her ticket. She was probably in her mid-40s, dressed in what looked like expensive workout gear, with that particular hairstyle that screams, "I want to speak to your manager from 3 gates away." "This is absolutely ridiculous," she was saying to the young man behind the counter. "I specifically requested an aisle seat, and you have me in a middle seat in the very back of the plane." The check-in agent, his name tag said Miguel, was being incredibly patient. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but according to our system, you purchased a basic economy ticket, which means seat selection isn't included. I can see if there are any aisle seats available for an upgrade fee." "Upgrade fee?" Karen's voice got higher and more shrill. "I am a frequent flyer with this airline. I demand you fix this right now." I was standing there, minding my own business, checking my phone to make sure I had all my boarding information ready. My flight wasn't until 10:30 a.m., but I always like to get to the airport early. Old habits from my teaching days, I was never late for anything. That's when I noticed something interesting. Miguel and another staff member behind the counter were having a quiet conversation in Spanish. The other employee was explaining that they were completely booked, and there really weren't any aisle seats available in economy. "No hay asientos disponibles en pasillo," she was saying. "Est completamente lleno el vuelo." I understood every word, of course. But Karen was so busy making a scene that she had no idea what they were discussing. Finally, Karen stepped aside, clearly frustrated but apparently done arguing for the moment. I approached the counter with my ID and phone ready. "Good morning," I said politely to Miguel. "I have my boarding pass on my phone, but I wanted to check if my seat assignment looks correct." Miguel smiled. He seemed relieved to deal with someone reasonable after Karen's tantrum. "Of course, ma'am. Let me take a look at your confirmation number." As I was reading off the numbers and letters, I could feel Karen standing nearby, clearly listening to our conversation. And that's when I heard it, this little snort of laughter. "Confirmation number?" she said, loud enough for everyone around us to hear. Can barely speak English and she's trying to travel alone. I felt my face get hot. Miguel looked uncomfortable, but he continued helping me professionally. "Your seat looks perfect, Mrs. Rodriguez," he said kindly. "Window seat, row 12. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" "Thank you so much," I replied, still maintaining my composure. "You've been very helpful." But Karen wasn't done. Beat 2 escalation continues. As I started to walk away, I heard her talking to another passenger behind her in line. Can you believe that? She said, not even bothering to lower her voice. These people come here and can't even be bothered to learn proper English. I mean, if you're going to live in America, at least try to sound American, right? The passenger she was talking to, an older gentleman who looked about as uncomfortable as I felt, just nodded politely and looked away. But Karen was on a roll now. I bet she doesn't even understand half of what these people are telling her. Probably has no idea how to navigate an airport by herself. I stopped walking. In all my years of dealing with ignorant comments, something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was because I was on my way to meet my granddaughter. Maybe it was because I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Or maybe I was just tired of letting people like her get away with this kind of behavior. I turned around and walked back toward the counter area. Excuse me, I said, looking directly at Karen. I couldn't help but overhear your comments about my English. She had the audacity to look surprised, like she hadn't expected me to actually understand what she was saying. Oh, she said, with this fake innocent expression. I wasn't talking to you. No, I agreed. You were talking about me. To a complete stranger, loudly enough for half the terminal to hear. Now we had an audience. Other passengers were starting to slow down and watch what was happening. Karen's face was getting red, and I could tell she was the type of person who didn't like being called out in public. Look, lady, she said, dropping any pretense of politeness. I'm just saying that if you're going to live in this country, maybe learn to speak the language properly. Some of us were born here and shouldn't have to strain to understand what you're trying to say. The check-in area was getting quieter. Miguel and his colleague were watching nervously from behind the counter. I could see a supervisor starting to walk over from across the terminal. I see, I said calmly. And where exactly were you born? Phoenix, Arizona, she said proudly. Born and raised, 4th-generation American. Interesting, I replied, because I've been living in Phoenix for 37 years. I taught bilingual education at Roosevelt Elementary for 25 of those years. I've probably taught English to more children than you've met in your entire life. Karen's expression faltered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. Well, maybe you should have spent more time teaching yourself, she snapped. And that's when I reached into my bag and everything changed. ACT 3, confrontation and twist. What I pulled out wasn't dramatic or threatening. It was just my wallet. But inside that wallet was something I always carried with me: my teaching certificate, my university degrees, and a small laminated card that Karen couldn't possibly have expected. You know what? I said, holding up the card. You're absolutely right that I should learn languages properly. That's why I have a master's degree in linguistics from Arizona State University. And this little card here? It's my certification as a Spanish interpreter for the federal court system. Karen's mouth fell open slightly. But you're also right that I should learn about the country I live in, I continued. Which is why I can tell you that Phoenix, Arizona sits on land that belonged to Mexico until 1848. The Sonoran Desert was home to indigenous people long before any Europeans arrived. And the name of your hometown? Phoenix, it's Greek. Not exactly American, is it? By now, the supervisor had reached us. She was an elegant Latina woman, probably in her 50s, with a name tag that read Maria Santos, Customer Service Manager. Is everything all right here? She asked, looking between Karen and me. Karen immediately turned to her with that entitled expression I was getting so familiar with. Yes, actually, there is a problem, Karen said. This woman is being confrontational and holding up the line with her language issues. I think she needs assistance understanding the check-in process. Maria looked at Karen for a long moment, then turned to me. ¿Puedo ayudarla en español, se ora? She asked. He escuchado lo que ha pasado aqui. Y quiero asegurarme de que est bien atendida. The words hit Karen like a slap in the face. Here was the supervisor, the person she just complained to about my language issues, speaking to me in fluent Spanish. But I wasn't done yet. Muchas gracias, I replied to Maria. Pero creo que ser a mejor continuar en inglés para que todos puedan entender la conversación. Then I turned back to Karen, who was standing there with her mouth hanging open. I just thanked Maria for offering to help me in Spanish, but I told her I thought it would be better to continue in English so everyone could understand our conversation. Just in case you were wondering what we said. Maria's professional mask slipped just enough for me to see the hint of a smile. Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand there was some confusion about languages and communication skills? Not confusion exactly, I said. This lady seems to believe that having an accent means I can't understand English properly. She's been making comments about my intelligence and my right to travel alone. Maria nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Karen. Ma'am, I need to inform you that this airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory language toward other passengers. What I've witnessed here could be grounds for refusing you service. Karen's face went pale. Wait, what? I wasn't discriminating. She was. You were mocking another passenger's accent and questioning her ability to navigate air travel based on her ethnicity, Maria said firmly. That's discrimination. But Maria wasn't finished. She turned back to me with a genuine smile. Mrs. Rodriguez, I noticed from your ticket that you're traveling to Miami for a family visit. Is this your first time flying with us? Actually, no, I said. I've been flying with this airline for probably 15 years. I have your credit card, I'm enrolled in your frequent flyer program. Though I have to admit, I don't fly often enough to have status. Maria's fingers flew over her computer keyboard. Let me just check your account. Oh my, Mrs. Rodriguez, you've been a loyal customer for 18 years. You've flown with us 47 times, and you've never had a single complaint or issue. She paused, looking at her screen with raised eyebrows. And I see here that you're listed in our system as a federal court interpreter. We actually have a special protocol for passengers who work in essential government services. Karen was looking back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match. What kind of protocol? I asked, genuinely curious. Well, Maria said, her smile getting wider, it means you're eligible for a complimentary upgrade to first class, with our thanks for your service to the community. The entire check-in area erupted in scattered applause. Other passengers who had been watching the drama unfold started clapping and cheering. Karen looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. But Maria wasn't done with her yet. As for you, ma'am, she said, turning back to Karen, I'm going to need to speak with you privately about your ticket situation. Miguel mentioned that you were having some issues with your seat assignment? Yes, I need an aisle seat, Karen stammered. Maria typed something into her computer. I see. You purchased a basic economy ticket, which doesn't include seat selection. And unfortunately, due to your behavior toward another passenger, I'm not able to offer you a complimentary upgrade. She paused, looking at her screen again. However, I do see that we have some seats available. In row 31, middle seat, right next to the lavatory. The crowd that had gathered was barely containing their laughter at this point. Row 31? Karen squeaked. But that's the very back of the plane. Yes, Maria agreed cheerfully. But don't worry, I'm sure you'll have plenty of time during the 4-hour flight to think about the importance of treating fellow passengers with respect. As I walked toward security with my new first-class boarding pass, I could hear Karen still arguing behind me, trying to negotiate her way out of the seat assignment from hell. Miguel caught up with me near the security checkpoint. Mrs. Rodriguez? He called out. I just wanted to apologize for what happened back there. And I wanted you to know my grandmother came here from Mexico when she was about your age. She worked as a seamstress for 40 years, and people used to make comments about her accent too. I stopped walking and looked at this young man who couldn't have been older than my youngest son. Your grandmother sounds like a strong woman, I said. She was, he agreed. She used to tell me that her accent wasn't a weakness, it was proof that she was brave enough to learn a whole new language, in a whole new country, to give her family a better life. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Your grandmother was a wise woman. She would have been proud to meet you today, Miguel said. The way you handled that situation. That was pure class. As I settled into my first-class seat 30 minutes later with extra legroom that my 62-year-old knees desperately appreciated, I couldn't stop thinking about the whole experience. You know, I've dealt with people like Karen my entire adult life. The customers who spoke louder and slower when they heard my accent. The parents who questioned whether I was qualified to teach their children. The strangers who assumed I was lost or confused just because English wasn't my first language. For most of my life, I've handled these situations the way I was raised to, with grace, patience, and quiet dignity. Turn the other cheek, take the high road, don't make waves. But something about that morning felt different. Maybe it was because I was on my way to meet my granddaughter, this tiny new person who would grow up in a world where I hoped accent discrimination would be a thing of the past. Or maybe it was because, at 62, I was finally tired of letting ignorant people make me feel small. About an hour into the flight, one of the flight attendants approached my seat with a warm smile. "Mrs. Rodriguez? I'm Carmen, and yes, before you ask, I was named after my grandmother who came here from Cuba in the 1960s. She held out a small plate with extra cookies and a note. "These are from the crew," she said. "We heard about what happened at check-in, and we wanted you to know that we're honored to have you on board today." I opened the note, and it was signed by the entire crew, some in English, some in Spanish, and one flight attendant had written in what looked like Portuguese. The note said, "Thank you for reminding us that America is beautiful because of our differences, not despite them. Enjoy your visit with your granddaughter." I looked up at Carmen with tears in my eyes. "How did you know about my granddaughter?" She winked. "Word travels fast on a good crew. And Maria called ahead to make sure you were taken care of." As we started our descent into Miami, I couldn't resist looking back toward the rear of the plane. Karen was squeezed into that middle seat in row 31, looking absolutely miserable. The passenger next to her was a large man who had apparently fallen asleep on her shoulder, and every few minutes, the lavatory door would open and close right next to her head. But here's the thing that really got me: she had spent the entire flight trying to get the flight attendants to move her to a different seat. And every single time she called for help, one of the crew members would politely explain in Spanish first, then in English that all other seats were occupied. Was it petty? Probably. Was it satisfying? Absolutely. When I finally made it to my daughter's apartment in Miami and held my granddaughter for the first time, I told Carmen the whole story. She laughed so hard she nearly woke the baby. "Mom," she said, "I can't believe you finally told off one of those people." I didn't tell her off, I corrected. I just reminded her that intelligence and worth aren't measured by how perfectly someone speaks a language they learned as an adult. Carmen looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like she was seeing me as more than just her mother. "You know what I want to do?" she said. "I want to teach this little one Spanish from birth. I want her to be proud of her heritage, proud of her accent if she has one, and proud of her abuela who stood up to airport bullies." I looked down at my sleeping granddaughter, this perfect little person who would grow up in a world where people like Karen still existed, but also in a world where people like Maria and Miguel and the flight crew were there to stand up for what's right. Extended reflection, the voice in my head. "You know, I've been thinking about that day a lot over the past few weeks. Not just about the satisfaction of watching Karen get her comeuppance, but about what the whole experience taught me about myself and the country I've called home for nearly 4 decades. The truth is, that confrontation at the airport forced me to examine something I'd been carrying around for years, a weight I didn't even realize had been pressing down on my shoulders until it was suddenly lifted. For 37 years, I've been living in this country, working hard, raising my family, and contributing to my community. I taught hundreds of children to read in 2 languages. I helped families navigate the court system as an interpreter. I volunteered at my church, participated in parent-teacher organizations, voted in every election, and paid my taxes without complaint. But I've also been carrying around this little voice in my head that whispered maybe people like Karen were right. Maybe my accent did make me less American. Maybe I should have tried harder to sound like I was born here. That voice started small, back in 1987 when I first arrived in Phoenix. I remember my first job interview at a department store. The manager, a woman about my age now, kept asking me to repeat myself. Not because she couldn't understand me, I could see the comprehension in her eyes, but because she wanted to make it clear that my way of speaking was somehow deficient. "We need someone who can communicate clearly with customers," she said finally, even though I had answered every question perfectly in what I thought was perfectly understandable English. I didn't get that job, or the next 3 I applied for. Each rejection made that little voice grow a little louder. Maybe if you just worked harder on your pronunciation. Maybe if you practiced more. Maybe if you tried to sound more normal. When I finally got hired at the elementary school, it was because the principal, Mrs. Henderson, was desperately trying to serve a growing population of Spanish-speaking students. She needed someone bilingual, and my accent wasn't a liability, it was an asset. But even then, even in an environment where my background was valued, I found myself constantly monitoring how I spoke. During parent conferences, I would practice difficult words in the mirror beforehand. I would speak slowly, carefully, making sure each consonant was crisp, each vowel perfectly American. I was performing a version of myself, trying to be American enough to belong. The voice got louder over the years. When my oldest son, Roberto, brought friends home from high school, I noticed how some of them would look puzzled when I spoke, then turn to him with questioning expressions. Roberto would explain, "That's just how my mom talks," with a slight embarrassment that he tried to hide but I could feel anyway. When my daughter Carmen started dating her future husband, I spent weeks before meeting his parents practicing small talk, rehearsing stories, trying to anticipate any words that might trip me up. I wanted them to see that their son was marrying into a good family, not a family that was somehow less American than theirs. The voice whispered during PTA meetings when other parents would smile politely but never quite engage me in the casual conversations that happened before and after the official business. It whispered when telemarketers would hang up the moment they heard my accent, assuming I wasn't worth their time. It whispered when customer service representatives would immediately ask to speak to someone else before even hearing what I needed. But that day at the airport, surrounded by Miguel and Maria and Carmen the flight attendant and all those passengers who applauded when I got my upgrade, I realized something important. My accent isn't a flaw that needs to be fixed. It's a badge of honor that represents courage, determination, and the willingness to start over in a new place for the sake of my family. Standing there in that terminal, watching Karen's face crumble as she realized her assumptions about me were completely wrong, I felt something shift inside me. It was like a dam breaking, releasing years of accumulated shame and self-doubt that I hadn't even admitted I was carrying. I thought about my grandmother, who never learned English but raised 7 children who all became American citizens. I thought about my mother, who cleaned houses for wealthy families while studying English at night so she could help us with our homework. I thought about my father, who worked construction for 30 years with men who sometimes mocked his accent but never questioned his work ethic or his integrity. None of them had ever apologized for the way they spoke. They wore their accents like medals of honor, proof that they had been brave enough to leave everything familiar behind and start over in a place where the very air felt foreign. When had I forgotten that? Every time someone hears my accent and makes assumptions about my intelligence, they're really just revealing their own ignorance. They're showing me that they lack the imagination to understand what it takes to function in a second language, the intellectual flexibility to appreciate the complexity of bilingual communication, the life experience to recognize strength when they hear it. And every time someone like Maria or Miguel hears my accent and responds with respect and kindness, they're reminding me that America really is a country built by immigrants who were brave enough to learn new languages and adapt to new cultures. Maria didn't hear my accent and think, "This woman needs help understanding English." She heard it and thought, "This woman has stories to tell, wisdom to share, experiences that have shaped her into someone worth listening to." Miguel didn't hear my accent and assume I was confused or lost. He heard it and recognized a kindred spirit, someone whose family had made the same courageous journey his grandmother had made decades earlier. The passengers who applauded didn't see my accent as something that needed to be overlooked or forgiven. They saw it as part of what made the moment meaningful, a reminder that standing up for dignity and respect transcends language barriers and cultural differences. In the days since that airport encounter, I've been paying attention to how I talk to myself. That critical voice is still there sometimes. Decades of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But now when it whispers, "Maybe you should have said that differently," I have a new response. Maybe the problem isn't how I said it. Maybe the problem is with people who think there's only one right way to be American. I've started speaking up more in conversations, volunteering to read at community events, offering to help with translation services at my church. Not because I've suddenly become more confident in my English was always fine. But because I've finally become confident in my right to use it however feels natural to me. My accent tells a story. It says, I was brave enough to leave my birthplace and learn a new language. I was determined enough to raise successful children in a culture that wasn't my own. I was strong enough to build a career helping others navigate the same challenges I faced. That's not a story I need to hide anymore. That's a story I'm proud to tell, one conversation at a time, in whatever accent feels like home. A few days after I got home to Phoenix, I was sitting on my back patio with my morning coffee, still glowing from the memories of holding my granddaughter for the first time. The desert sunrise was painting the sky in those soft pink and orange hues that never get old, no matter how many years you've lived here. I was flipping through the mail, mostly bills and advertisements, when I saw an envelope that made me pause. It was addressed to me in elegant handwriting, with the airline's logo in the corner. For a moment, my heart sank. Was this some kind of complaint follow-up? Had Karen somehow managed to file a report about our encounter? But when I opened it, what I found inside took my breath away. It was a handwritten note from Maria Santos, the customer service manager who had turned my terrible morning into one of the most satisfying experiences of my life. "Dear Mrs. Rodriguez," the note began, and I could almost hear Maria's warm voice as I read her careful script. "I wanted you to know that your grace under pressure that morning inspired our entire staff. We had our weekly team meeting 2 days after your flight, and your story was all anyone could talk about. Miguel couldn't stop praising how you handled yourself with such dignity, even when that other passenger was being so disrespectful. But more than that, your encounter made us realize we needed to do better as an airline. We've decided to implement additional cultural sensitivity training for all our employees, not just customer service, but baggage handlers, gate agents, flight crews, everyone. We're partnering with the local community college to develop a program that teaches our staff about the beautiful diversity of our passengers and how to recognize and address discrimination when we see it. And here's the part one hope makes you smile. We're using your story with your permission, of course, as an example of how to turn a negative situation into a positive one. Not just for our employees, but for our passengers too. We want everyone to know that standing up for yourself and others isn't just acceptable, it's admirable. Miguel asked me to tell you that he's enrolled in Spanish classes now. He said meeting you made him realize he wanted to connect better with passengers who speak his grandmother's language. And Carmen, the flight attendant who served you in first class. She's started a diversity committee among our crew members. Your courage that morning started something bigger than any of us expected. We've already had 3 other passengers reach out to thank us for taking a stand against discrimination, and 2 of them shared their own stories of airport bias that we're now investigating. P.S. I hope you had a wonderful time meeting your granddaughter. I have 5 grandchildren myself, and I know there's no love quite like it. There's something about holding that tiny person and knowing you played a part in creating the world they'll inherit that makes everything else seem both more important and less overwhelming at the same time. I had to set the letter down for a moment because my eyes were getting misty. Here I thought that confrontation with Karen was just about one terrible morning and one satisfying comeback. But Maria was telling me it had become something much bigger. I reread the letter 3 more times, each time catching details I'd missed. The fact that Miguel was learning Spanish because of our encounter. The way Carmen had started a diversity committee. The other passengers who were now speaking up about their own experiences. It made me think about something my own grandmother used to tell me when I was a little girl back in Guadalajara. "Mija," she would say, "every time you stand up straight instead of bending down, you make it easier for the next person to stand up too." At the time, I thought she was just talking about posture. But sitting there on my patio, reading Maria's letter, I finally understood what she really meant. I carefully folded the letter and walked inside to my desk, where I keep my most important documents. I opened the drawer where I store my teaching certificates, my naturalization papers, my court interpreter credentials, all the official proof of the life I've built in this country. I'm keeping that note in my wallet, right next to my teaching certificate and my court interpreter card. Because sometimes, when you're feeling small or invisible or like your voice doesn't matter, you need a reminder that standing up for yourself with dignity and intelligence can create ripples of change that extend far beyond one bad encounter at an airport check-in counter. But as I slipped the letter into my wallet, I realized Maria's note meant even more than that. It was proof that the America I believed in when I first arrived here 40 years ago, the America where hard work and respect matter more than where you were born or how you sound when you speak, that America still exists. It lives in people like Miguel and Maria and Carmen and all the passengers who clapped that morning when I got my upgrade. 3 weeks later, I got another surprise. Miguel called me at home. "Mrs. Rodriguez? This is Miguel from the airport. I hope it's okay that I'm calling you. Maria gave me your number because I wanted to thank you personally." He went on to tell me that the airline had asked him to help develop their new training program. They wanted his perspective as a bilingual employee who had witnessed discrimination firsthand. "But the real reason I'm calling," he said, "is because I wanted you to know that my Spanish is getting pretty good now. And last week, I was able to help an elderly gentleman from El Salvador who was confused about his connecting flight. His English wasn't very strong, and he was getting frustrated trying to explain his situation to another agent. Miguel paused, and I could hear the pride in his voice. I was able to switch over and help him in Spanish, just like you would have done. And when I saw the relief on his face, the way his whole body relaxed when he realized someone understood him, I thought about you and that morning with Karen. That's wonderful, Miguel, I said, feeling my own chest swell with pride for this young man I barely knew. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to know something, he continued. That day changed how I see my job. I'm not just checking people in for flights anymore. I'm helping people navigate one of the most stressful parts of travel, and sometimes that means standing up for them when others won't. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my living room looking at the photos of my children and grandchildren scattered across the coffee table. I thought about all the times over the years when I'd stayed quiet in the face of ignorance, all the times I'd let comments about my accent or my background slide by without response. I used to think that was wisdom, that picking your battles meant avoiding conflict whenever possible. But maybe real wisdom is knowing when your battle isn't just about you. Maybe it's about the Miguel who needs to see that standing up for others is part of being a good person. Maybe it's about the next grandmother who travels alone and faces someone like Karen. And who knows, maybe the next time someone like Karen tries to make someone feel ashamed of their accent, she'll remember the story of the woman who turned the tables with grace, education, and a little help from some very good people who understood that America is stronger when we celebrate our differences instead of mocking them. Because here's what I've learned in my 62 years, every act of courage, no matter how small it seems in the moment, gives permission for someone else to be brave. Every time we refuse to be made small, we make space for others to stand tall. That's a lesson worth teaching, in any language. And thanks to Maria's letter, I know it's a lesson that's still being taught, one airport encounter at a time. The desert sun was fully up now, and my coffee had gone cold. But I felt warmer than I had in years.